I wasn't supposed to be there that afternoon. He wasn't supposed to care. He had spent 3 years building walls around himself and his son, keeping the world at arm's length, and it had been working just fine, until he saw the man in the hoodie reach beneath his jacket. 1 second. That's all it took. The former Navy SEAL who had buried that version of himself in a quiet Colorado town made a decision that would cost him a bullet, expose a billion-dollar conspiracy, and drag 4 broken people towards something none of them had been looking for. If this is your first time here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this one. Drop a like and tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The park was ordinary in the way that Tuesday afternoons in late September always are. Kids shouting over each other, dogs pulling their leashes towards the water fountain, a father somewhere yelling at his son to stop climbing the wrong side of the slide. Westbridge, Colorado wasn't a remarkable place. It sat in the valley between 2 ridge lines that turned purple in the evenings, and it had exactly one coffee shop that everyone agreed was mediocre, but nobody ever stopped going to. People moved here to disappear from something. Most of them managed it. Gavin Holt had managed it for 3 years. He stood near the far end of Meadowcrest Park's soccer field with his arms crossed, watching Owen dribble badly toward a goal that had been set up with 2 orange cones. The boy was 7 years old and not particularly gifted at soccer, which didn't bother Gavin at all. Owen had inherited his mother's stubbornness and his father's refusal to quit a thing just because he wasn't naturally good at it. Every Tuesday, they came to this field. Every Tuesday, Owen worked on the same move, a sharp cut to the left that he almost never landed cleanly. And every Tuesday, Gavin told him the same thing. Sell it before you make it. Make him think you're going right. I know, Dad. Then do it. Owen tried again, caught his own feet, and stumbled into the grass. He sat there for a moment, breathing hard through his nose. I did it, he said flatly. You fell down. I fell down after I did it. Gavin almost smiled. Almost. Get up. Again. The late afternoon light was flattening out across the field, turning everything golden and a little hazy. Gavin had been on a job site since 5 in the morning, a commercial build in the warehouse district east of town, and his shoulders carried the particular kind of tiredness that concrete work produced, deep in the bones rather than the muscles. He'd grabbed sandwiches from the deli on Crenshaw before picking Owen up from school. The boy had eaten his in the truck without asking what kind it was, which meant the grieving had eased a little more since last month. That was how Gavin measured time now. Not in weeks or months, in small things. Whether Owen asked for his mother during dinner, whether he wanted the closet light left on, whether he ate his sandwich without checking. Laura had been gone for 2 years and 4 months. She'd had an aggressive form of leukemia that moved faster than any of them were prepared for. The diagnosis came in October. She died in February. There was a stretch somewhere in those 4 months that Gavin couldn't account for now. Weeks that existed only as a gray smear in his memory. A period when he had gone through every motion of being a husband and a father, while something essential inside him had quietly switched off. He didn't talk about it. That wasn't his way. He found a construction crew, worked longer hours than anyone thought reasonable, took on projects that required him to study blueprints until midnight. He kept Owen in his routine: school, dinner, homework, Tuesday soccer, Saturday breakfast at the diner on 5th. Structure was the only thing he trusted anymore. The SEALs had taught him that much, at least. When you can't control the outcome, control the process. He'd left the Navy 8 years ago, long enough that the life felt like it had belonged to someone else. He never mentioned it to anyone on his crew. The other workers knew him as a guy who showed up early, never complained, and had an unsettling ability to look at a half-built wall and tell you exactly why it was going to fail in 6 months. His foreman, Ray Delacoste, had once called him the quietest man I've ever met, who still managed to make everyone feel slightly nervous. Gavin had taken that as a compliment. He wasn't nervous now. He was watching Owen try the cut again, better this time, left foot finding the ground properly, when something in his peripheral vision shifted. Not a loud thing, not a dramatic thing, just a change in the texture of the afternoon, the way a sound or a shape fails to fit its surroundings. Gavin's attention moved before his brain fully understood why. The playground equipment sat maybe 60 yards to his left. A cluster of kids ranging from 4 to maybe 10 years old occupied the swings, the climbing structure, the low platform near the slide. Among them, a small girl in a yellow jacket was perched on top of the climbing frame, legs dangling, watching the bigger kids below her with serious eyes. She looked maybe 6. She was alone up there, which struck Gavin only later as slightly odd. Not abandoned, just apart in the way that some kids are, comfortable in their own observation. Near the playground's edge, seated on a bench with a phone in her hands, was a woman in her early 30s. Dark hair pulled back. Good coat, not cheap. She was glancing up regularly at the girl in the yellow jacket, with the particular attention of a parent who trusted the space without fully relaxing into it. A professional habit, monitoring without hovering. None of that was what had pulled Gavin's attention. What had pulled his attention was the man near the maintenance shed at the park's eastern boundary. He was wearing a gray hoodie, hood up despite the mild temperature. Standing just at the edge of the tree line, not moving. That alone wasn't unusual. People stopped all the time. But people who stopped near parks usually faced the park. This man's body language was off. Weight forward, right shoulder dropped slightly lower than the left, one hand already tucked beneath the front of his jacket. Gavin had seen that posture before. He'd seen it in places where seeing it meant someone was about to die. His body processed the situation approximately 2 seconds before his conscious mind caught up. The man's eyes were tracking the girl in the yellow jacket. Steady, deliberate. Not the kind of looking people do when they're watching kids play. The kind of looking that had a purpose attached to it. Gavin was already moving. "Owen, stay here." He said it without inflection, without alarm, because a panicked voice carried and a panicked voice made people look. And right now, the last thing he wanted was for that man near the tree line to realize he'd been spotted. Owen looked up. "Dad?" "Don't move. Right here. I'll be back." He crossed the field at an angle, keeping his path diagonal rather than direct. Not running, not rushing. Walking with the particular purposefulness of a man who knows exactly what he's doing and doesn't need to announce it. His eyes stayed on the man in the hoodie. The man hadn't moved yet. The girl in the yellow jacket had climbed down from the frame and was now closer to the ground, walking toward the slide. The man's hand began to come out from under his jacket. Gavin ran. He covered the distance between the soccer field and the playground in a way that startled everyone who later tried to describe it, because they couldn't reconcile it with what they expected from a man who looked like a tired construction worker. He didn't shout. He didn't flail. He moved in a direct line, his entire focus narrowed to 2 points: the girl and the angle between her and the man's hand. "Down!" His voice cracked across the playground like a physical thing. Parents jerked upright. Kids froze. The woman on the bench spun to her feet. The man in the hoodie raised a handgun. Gavin hit the girl with his shoulder and both arms simultaneously, wrapping himself around her, rotating his own body to take the angle. The gun fired. He felt the impact before he heard it properly. A sharp, tearing pressure high on his left side that punched the air out of him and dropped his leg out from under him. He went down hard, one knee, then the other. The girl pressed to his chest and his arms locked around her. She was screaming. He couldn't blame her. "Hey!" His voice came out ragged. The pain was arriving in full now, a deep burning that told him something had gone through rather than just across. "Hey, look at me. Right here." The girl, Maisie, he would learn her name later, stopped screaming and looked at him with enormous, terrified eyes. "Put your hands here." He moved her small hands to his side, pressing them flat against the wound. "Press hard. Don't stop." "It's wet," she whispered. "I know. Keep pressing." He looked up. The man in the hoodie was gone, had run the moment the shot drew attention, was already past the tree line and into whatever came after. Gavin scanned the crowd, which was moving in the chaotic, uncertain way that crowds move when something violent has happened, and no one is sure whether it's over. He needed Owen. That was the only other calculation his mind was running. "Is he yours?" He looked up. The woman from the bench was kneeling beside him now. Up close, she was younger than he'd initially placed her. Sharp features, composed in the way of someone who was not composed at all, but had decided composure was currently more useful than falling apart. Her eyes were moving between him and Maisie with a fast professional assessment. "Small boy, soccer clothes, over there." Gavin nodded toward the field. 7 years old, Owen. He won't come when you call unless you tell him I asked. She was already standing, already calling over a security detail Gavin hadn't even noticed. Two men in civilian clothing who materialized from positions around the park with the practiced efficiency of people who took their jobs seriously. That registered dimly. Security detail. He filed it away and focused on staying upright. The pain was bad now. Not the worst he'd ever experienced. That was a different time, a different country, and a story that belonged to someone younger. But bad enough that his vision was narrowing at the edges, and he knew if he let himself go down the rest of the way, he wasn't going to stay conscious. He kept one hand over Maisie's, pressing against his own side, and used the other arm to brace himself. The man. He stopped a bystander, a heavy-set guy in a running jacket who had his phone out but hadn't dialed anything yet. Did anyone get him? Which direction did he go? The man pointed vaguely east. He just ran. I don't... Call 911. Give them east from Meadowcrest Park, gray hoodie. Gavin looked at the runner's shoes. New, good traction. He's fast. Tell them he's armed. The man fumbled with his phone. Gavin turned back to Maisie, who had not moved her hands and was still pressing, her small face tight with concentration and shock. You're doing great, he told her, and meant it. What's your name? Maisie. I'm Gavin. I need you to keep doing exactly that until someone with a first aid bag gets here. Can you do that? She nodded without speaking, her jaw set. He was losing more blood than he'd like. He could feel it, the wet warmth spreading down his side, soaking through his flannel shirt and into his jeans. The bullet had entered high on the left, below the ribs, and he'd caught enough anatomy over the years to know the range of possibilities that presented. Most of them were survivable with prompt attention. A couple weren't. He had no way to know which category he was in, so he stopped trying to calculate it and focused on the ground directly in front of him. Owen appeared at the edge of the crowd, pushing through, his face white and his soccer cleats still on his feet. The woman was with him, one hand on his shoulder, steering him carefully. Dad. Owen's voice was very small. Here. I'm here. Gavin reached out with his free hand, and Owen grabbed it with both of his. Hey. I'm okay. Listen to me. I'm okay. You're bleeding. I know. Doctors are coming. You see those lights? He could hear sirens already, distant but closing fast. They're fast. Look at me. He waited until Owen met his eyes. I need you to be steady right now. Just for a few minutes. Can you be steady? Owen's throat worked. He was fighting it. The fear, the tears, whatever was rising up behind his eyes. He pressed his lips together the way his mother used to do when she was deciding something. Yeah, he said finally, I can do that. Good. Gavin held his hand and kept his other hand over Maisie's. Good. The woman crouched beside him again. Her composure had cracked slightly at the edges now. Not breaking, just visible. She looked at Maisie and touched the girl's hair briefly, a quick, confirming gesture, then looked at Gavin. I'm Camille Voss, she said, as though the name should mean something to him. Gavin looked at her. Is that your daughter? Yes. She's brave, he said. She kept her hands on the wound. Not a lot of adults would do that. Something shifted in Camille Voss's face. Not the composure breaking, but something underneath it. Something that didn't have a name yet, but would, eventually, change the direction of 4 people's lives. Who are you? She asked. He was going to answer. But the paramedics arrived then, and Maisie was finally gently moved aside, and the afternoon swallowed everything else in a rush of voices and equipment and bright light. The paramedic who reached him first was young, efficient, and had the particular tone of someone who had seen worse but still wanted to communicate urgency without panic. Sir, I need you to lie back. My son, Gavin said. He's right there, sir. We've got him. You need to tell him I'm okay. Say it where he can hear you. The paramedic glanced at Owen, then back at Gavin, then raised his voice slightly. Your dad's going to be okay. We're going to take good care of him. Owen made a sound that wasn't quite crying and wasn't quite not crying. Gavin let himself go down. The sky above Meadowcrest Park was enormous and turning orange at the edges, and somewhere behind the paramedic's shoulder, he could see one of the cottonwood trees dropping its last leaves in the still air, slow and unhurried, the way things fall when there's no wind to rush them. He had a thought, brief and clear before the dark edge of unconsciousness took over, that felt less like a thought and more like something settling. He'd saved the girl. Owen was safe. Everything else could wait. The surgery took 3 hours and 40 minutes. Gavin didn't know that at the time, obviously. He was under for all of it. The kind of deep, dreamless unconsciousness that his body had earned through blood loss and shock rather than any genuine rest. The bullet had entered below his left rib cage at an angle, nicked the edge of his spleen, and lodged itself against a lower rib without punching through. The trauma surgeon who worked on him, a compact woman named Dr. Reyes, who had trained at Denver Health and had the particular economy of movement that comes from years of not wasting a single motion, told the nurse afterward, that whoever had applied pressure to the wound in the field had bought the patient a meaningful amount of time. The whoever in question had been a 6-year-old girl. Gavin found that out 3 days later when he was finally lucid enough to piece together a coherent sequence of events. I was sitting upright in his hospital bed, the left side of his torso wrapped in tender, an IV line still running into his right arm, when the nurse, a heavy-set man named Derek, who had the gentle authority of someone who'd spent decades managing patients who didn't want to be managed, told him that his son had been asking for him every 4 hours since they'd brought him in. "Where is he?" Gavin asked immediately. "He's fine. He's been staying with a Ms. Voss. She arranged a room nearby. She's been with him since yesterday morning." Gavin was quiet for a moment. "She didn't have to do that." Derek gave him the look of a man who had heard stranger things. "No, she did not." Owen came in an hour later, still in the same soccer clothes from the park, because apparently the bag Gavin had packed for him was still sitting in the truck in the hospital parking lot, which Owen had pointed out to Camille Voss 3 separate times, and she had 3 separate times said she would take care of it, and then gotten distracted by a phone call. Owen was not annoyed about this exactly, but he mentioned it. "She's on her phone a lot," Owen said, climbing carefully into the chair beside the bed rather than the bed itself, because he had assessed the tubes and the bandaging and reached the quiet conclusion that jumping on his father was probably a bad idea right now. "She runs a company," Gavin said. "She told me. She said it's a technology company." Owen considered this. "Maisie says her mom builds things that help cities figure out where to put power lines. I don't really get it." "Neither do I. How's Maisie?" Owen picked at a loose thread on the arm of the chair. "She was really scared at first. She cried a lot the first night, but she's okay now. We watched 3 movies. He paused. "She picks good movies." "Yeah?" "She picked the one about the sled dogs. And then she picked the one about the guy who fixes the lighthouse. And then she wanted to watch a cartoon, but I said we'd already watched 2 movies, and she said that didn't count because the lighthouse one was boring." Owen seemed to find this deeply reasonable. "So we compromised. We watched the first half of the cartoon and then stopped." "That's not a compromise. That's just stopping a cartoon in the middle." "She was asleep by then anyway." Gavin looked at his son for a long moment. Owen's face had more color than it had the last time Gavin had seen it clearly. In the park, white as paper, fighting to hold himself together because his father had asked him to. He was holding together now too, in a different way. The particular steadiness of a kid who has decided that being upset is a luxury that can wait until the immediate situation is resolved. He looked like his mother when he did that. "Come here," Gavin said. Owen climbed onto the bed very carefully, avoiding the left side entirely, and settled into the crook of Gavin's right arm. He didn't say anything. Neither did Gavin. They stayed like that for several minutes while the IV dripped and the monitor beeped its dull, steady rhythm and the afternoon light shifted across the floor. "I was scared," Owen said finally into Gavin's shoulder. "I know. The lady, Camille, she stayed with me the whole time. She didn't leave until she knew you were out of surgery." Gavin absorbed that. "She stayed the whole time?" "She sat in those plastic chairs for like 4 hours. I fell asleep, and when I woke up, she was still there." Owen was quiet for a beat. "She was reading something on her laptop, but she kept checking whether I was okay." Gavin didn't respond to that right away. He was thinking about something. The brief exchange in the park. The composure in her face. The way she'd moved when she understood what was happening. He'd filed it away under things to examine later. Later had apparently arrived. "She wasn't what I expected," he said, mostly to himself. Owen looked up at him. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone who called her assistant to handle it." Owen seemed to consider whether this was a fair assessment of anyone. "She does have a lot of assistants," he said finally, "but she handles a lot herself." Camille Voss came to the room that evening. She knocked, which surprised Gavin, because in his experience, people with her level of money and position didn't usually knock. They entered and assumed the entry was welcome. She knocked and then waited until he said, "Come in," and then she opened the door and stood in the threshold for a moment as though checking that she wasn't interrupting something. She looked different than she had in the park. Less assembled somehow. Still put together, still composed, but with the edges of something real showing through. She'd changed clothes at some point, but her hair wasn't as precisely managed, and there were the faint shadows under her eyes of someone who hadn't slept properly in 2 nights. "You look better," she said. "I look terrible," Gavin said. "But I feel better. Those are different things." She almost smiled. Not quite. "Fair." She moved into the room and sat in the chair Owen had vacated, and for a moment she looked at the floor in a way that told him she had prepared something to say and was now reconsidering how to say it. "I want to thank you," she began. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She looked up at him directly. "You took a bullet for my daughter. You didn't know her. You didn't know me. You ran toward her." She stopped, cleared her throat. "I have security people whose entire job is to protect Maisie and I, and not one of them got there before you did." Gavin thought about saying something neutral and deflecting, which was his usual approach to situations where someone was grateful in a way that made him uncomfortable. Instead, he said, "Your security wasn't positioned for a threat from the maintenance perimeter. They were watching the access points. Whoever planned that approach knew your security layout." Camille went very still. "That's..." She started and stopped. "That's not a construction worker observation." "No," he agreed. "It's not." The silence that followed was careful on both sides. "Who are you?" she asked. And it wasn't the panicked, blood-soaked question from the park. This was different. This was someone who had spent 2 days turning a question over in her mind and had finally decided to ask it directly. Gavin looked at the ceiling for a moment. "Gavin Holt. I'm a construction worker. I've been working in Westbridge for 3 years. Before that I was in the Navy." Specifically, he looked at her. She met his eyes without flinching, which he noted. "Navy SEALs," he said. 12 years. I got out when my wife was pregnant with Owen. I didn't want that life anymore." "And you became a construction worker." "I was already good at it. I'd been doing it summers since I was 16. It's honest work and it doesn't follow you home." He paused. "Usually." She nodded slowly, the way someone nods when information is landing in the place where a theory used to be. "That's why you moved the way you did in the park. That's why you had Maisie applying pressure before the paramedics arrived." "She did it well," Gavin said, and meant it. "She kept her hand steady. A lot of people can't manage that." "She told me." Something crossed Camille's face, a complicated emotion that involved pride and terror in roughly equal measure. "She said the man told her she was doing great, and she believed him, so she didn't move." Gavin didn't say anything to that. Camille straightened in the chair and shifted into a different register. The one, he suspected, that she used when she had made a decision, and was presenting it as though it were simply the next logical step. "I want to cover all of your medical expenses. I've already spoken with the hospital administrator, and I'd like to give you $100,000. The number sat between them. "No," Gavin said. Camille blinked, just once, but genuinely. "I'm sorry? I don't want the money." "Mr. Holt." "Gavin." "Gavin." She adjusted. "You were seriously injured protecting my daughter. You have a son to take care of. You won't be able to work for... I have savings and I have sick leave. I appreciate the offer. I don't want it." She studied him the way people study things they don't immediately understand. Not suspiciously. More like she was genuinely trying to locate the variable she'd miscalculated. In her world, Gavin suspected, everyone wanted something, and the ones who claimed they didn't were usually building toward a larger ask. "What do you want then?" she asked, and the directness of it was almost refreshing. "For Owen to be able to finish his soccer season," Gavin said, "and for you to let me know if anyone comes after Maisie again." "You think someone will?" "I think what happened in the park wasn't random," he said. "The approach angle, the timing, the knowledge of your security positioning. That's planned. And planned things don't usually stop after the first attempt unless someone decides to stop planning them." Camille was quiet for a long moment. Something was working behind her eyes, rapid and controlled, The way someone thinks when they're already 3 steps into a problem and trying to decide whether to admit they've been there for a while. "I'll look into it," she said finally. "Good." He shifted against the pillow. "How's Maisie today?" "Actually." The formality dropped slightly. "She had nightmares the first night. She woke up screaming twice. Last night she only woke up once." She exhaled. "She asked this morning if the man was going to come back. I told her no." "Was that the truth?" "I don't know," Camille said, and the honesty of it seemed to cost her something. "I told her it was." Gavin nodded. He understood the calculation. He'd made versions of it himself, with Owen, in the weeks after Laura died. The small, necessary lies that kept a child's world intact long enough for the adult to figure out how to protect it. "She asked about you too," Camille added. "She wants to know if you're going to be okay." "Tell her yes." "Is that the truth?" He almost smiled. "Tell her yes." The medical expenses were handled regardless of his objection. He found that out from Derek the nurse 2 days later, who told him with some amusement that the bill had been settled, and there was nothing Gavin could do about it now because the transaction was complete. Gavin was annoyed about this. He was also not surprised, because Camille Voss had the particular energy of someone who respected other people's wishes up to the precise point where she'd decided the wish was impractical. He was discharged after 8 days. He went home to the small rental house on Alder Street that he and Owen had occupied for 3 years, and for the first 2 weeks he sat on the couch and worked on not going crazy. Owen was in school. Gavin had been told explicitly by Dr. Reyes that he was not to lift anything heavier than a gallon of milk for 6 weeks, which meant the job site was out of the question, which meant he had a great deal of time to sit with the particular restlessness of a man who has never been good at stillness. He read the police reports that a detective named Marsh had sent over. The shooter had been identified, a man named Calder, late 30s, with a history of mental instability and 2 prior restraining orders, no criminal record beyond minor incidents. He'd been caught 2 days after the park, tried to run, made it about 4 blocks. The investigation into his motive was ongoing, but the preliminary read was that it was personal, connected to Camille Voss in some way that the detective hadn't fully traced yet. Personal. Gavin turned that over. He thought about what he'd told Camille in the hospital, planned, knowing the security layout, the angle of approach. None of that was consistent with a mentally unstable man acting alone on personal obsession. That was consistent with someone who had access to information about Camille Voss's security setup and had used that information to point an unstable person at a target. He was still thinking about it when Camille called. She called his personal cell, which she'd gotten from somewhere. The hospital, probably, or possibly from Owen, who had apparently exchanged numbers with Maisie while they were watching the Sled Dog movie. "I need to ask you something," she said without preamble, "and I'd prefer to ask in person." "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "I'm on my couch." She came to Alder Street the next afternoon, which was not what he'd expected. He'd assumed she would suggest a restaurant or her office, somewhere that was her territory. But she showed up in a dark SUV with one of her security detail and knocked on his front door, and when he opened it, she was holding a paper bag from the deli on Crenshaw. "Your son told me you like the turkey on rye," she said. Gavin looked at the bag. "He talks too much." "He's 7. It's appropriate." She held up the bag. "Can I come in?" The house was clean in the functional way of a single father who had given up on aesthetics and committed entirely to order. No dishes in the sink. A clear path through the living room. Owen's soccer cleats by the door, precisely parallel, because Gavin had asked him 400 times to leave them like that. A construction industry trade magazine on the coffee table next to a half-finished cup of coffee that had been there since morning. Camille sat at the kitchen table and didn't visibly assess the house, which he appreciated. She'd been having her company investigated, she told him. Not officially, not in a way that would alert anyone internally. She'd used an outside firm, a private investigative group she trusted, and she'd asked them to look specifically at the construction division. "Why construction?" Gavin asked. "Because we're 18 months into a headquarters expansion that should have been done in 12, and the cost overruns have been significant. My CFO keeps finding budget anomalies he can't explain. I kept being told it was material costs, contractor delays, the usual, but the numbers were wrong in a way I couldn't pin down." "What kind of wrong?" "The kind where the project manager's explanation almost makes sense, but not quite." She pulled the folder from her bag, actual paper, not a tablet, which surprised him, and slid it across the table. The investigator found 3 contracts that were awarded to subcontractors with no prior work history in Colorado, incorporated within the last 18 months. All 3 registered to shell companies that trace back to the same parent entity in Nevada. Gavin opened the folder and looked at the first page. He wasn't an accountant and he wasn't a lawyer, but he understood construction contracts the way a former Navy SEAL understands operational logistics. Not from theory, but from years of watching things that should work fail because someone cut the wrong corner or falsified the wrong number. He turned pages slowly. "Your executive construction supervisor," he said. "Dale Brannick. He's been with the company how long? 7 years? And he signed all 3 of these contracts." "Yes." "Did he also approve the change orders?" Gavin turned to the 3rd page and pointed. "These materials substitutions. Someone signed off on switching from the specified structural steel to a lower grade. Same signature." Camille leaned over and looked. Something went through her expression. "I didn't catch that." "It's buried in the change order documentation. Easy to miss if you're not reading every page." He closed the folder. "You have a problem." "I know I have a problem. The question is—" She stopped, pressed her lips together. "The question is how deep it goes and who else is involved. Have you told anyone about this investigation?" "My general counsel. That's it." "Good. Keep it that way." He pushed the folder back toward her. "What do you need from me?" She looked at him steadily. "I want to offer you a position, overseeing construction operations, specifically the headquarters expansion. Officially, you'd be coming in as a senior project consultant, someone I brought in because the overruns concerned me and I wanted an outside perspective. That gives you access to everything without tipping off whoever's involved." Gavin was quiet. "You have the background," she continued. 12 years of SEAL operations, which means you understand how to gather information without showing your hand. And you have 15 years of actual construction experience. I know because I had you looked into after the hospital, which I should probably mention. "You investigated me." "Yes." He wasn't angry exactly. He was noting it the way he noted most things. "What did you find?" "That you're exactly who you said you were. Navy SEAL, 12 years, honorable discharge. 3 years with Kelso Construction in Westbridge, reputation as the most technically accurate site supervisor they've had. And," she paused, "that you never spoke about your military background to anyone at work. Not once. Your foreman said he didn't know until he read it in the news story about the park." "Ray talks too much," Gavin said. "He also said you caught a foundation error on the Millerton warehouse project that would have resulted in partial collapse within 2 years. You found it because you reread the original soil report and noticed the test core samples had been taken in the wrong locations. Someone had to read them." "Mr. Holt." She stopped. "Gavin, I'm not doing this out of charity. I'm doing this because my company is being robbed from the inside and I need someone I can trust. And the fact that you took a bullet for my daughter without knowing my name tells me something about your character that a background check can't." It was a good argument. He turned it over, looking for the angle that bothered him, because something always bothered him. "Owen," he said. "What about him?" "He can't know the real reason I'm there. As far as he's concerned, it's a job. I don't bring work home." "Of course. And if this goes where I think it's going, if Brannick has partners, if the shell companies connect back to someone with real leverage, it gets dangerous. Not construction site dangerous. The other kind." Camille met his eyes. "I know." "You're sure you want to do this?" "Someone tried to shoot my daughter in a public park," she said, and for the first time the composure showed its real texture. Not a wall, but a decision. Something she'd chosen rather than something she'd been born with. "Yes, I'm sure." The day before Gavin was supposed to start at Voss Meridian, an anonymous text arrived on his cell phone. He was in the kitchen when it came through, making Owen's lunch for school, peanut butter and honey, cut on the diagonal because Owen had gone through a phase about diagonal cuts 2 years ago, and the phase had apparently never ended. He picked up his phone. Unknown number, 7 words. "Stay away from Camille. She belongs to us." He read it twice, put the phone face down on the counter, finished making the sandwich. Owen came in from the bathroom, backpack already on, hair damp from where he'd apparently attempted to fix it with water and given up. "Is there an apple?" he asked. "Bag on the counter." Owen grabbed an apple and studied it with the deep suspicion of someone who had received mealy apples in the past. Apparently it passed inspection because he put it in his backpack. You start that new job tomorrow? Yeah. Is it far? Other side of town, 20 minutes. Owen seemed to do some internal calculation. So pickup's still the same? I'll be there. Gavin picked up his phone, photographed the message, sent it to a number he had for the detective, Marsh, with a brief note. Then he deleted the original and set the phone back down. Bus in the morning, same as usual. Okay. Owen paused in the kitchen doorway. Dad, that lady, Camille. What about her? Owen was quiet for a second in the careful way of a kid who is deciding whether to say the thing he's actually thinking. She's nice, he said finally. Not fake nice. She didn't treat me like a little kid. Gavin looked at his son. She asked me what scared me most that day, Owen continued. Not like she was trying to make me feel better, like she actually wanted to know. What did you tell her? I said I was scared you weren't going to come back. He said it matter-of-factly, the way kids sometimes say the most devastating things. And she said she understood that. She said when she was little, her dad traveled a lot for work, and there was always this thing in her stomach when he left. He shrugged. I don't know. It made me feel less alone with it, Gavin said. Yeah. Owen pulled his backpack straps tighter. She's not what I thought a billionaire would be like. What did you think a billionaire would be like? Owen considered. More loud about it, I guess. Gavin picked up his coffee cup. Go catch the bus. Owen went, the screen door banging behind him in the way it always did, because Gavin had fixed the spring 4 times, and it kept going wrong again. The kitchen was quiet. Gavin stood at the counter and thought about the anonymous text. She belongs to us. Not a threat against Camille directly, not a threat against him. A statement of ownership, which was a different and in many ways uglier thing. People who used that language, she belongs to us, were operating from a logic that didn't include Camille Voss as a person with her own choices. They were operating from a position of control they believed they were entitled to. He thought about the shooter in the park, the approach angle, the knowledge of the security layout. He thought about Dale Brannick's signature on the fraudulent contracts. Then his phone rang, not a text, a call, from a number he'd started recognizing over the past 2 weeks. It was Marcus Webb, one of Camille's senior security staff. His voice was tight and measured in the way of someone delivering information they know is bad. We have a situation at the headquarters site, Marcus said. You need to hear this before tomorrow. Gavin set down his coffee. Tell me. Someone accessed the construction site last night. We had a guard. He was hit. He's okay, concussion, but he didn't see much. They got inside the east wing, the section that was reported last week. Gavin felt the particular cold clarity that used to come over him before an operation. How bad? The structural steel framing on floors 3 through 5. Cut. Systematically. Cut with what? That's the thing. Marcus paused. Not a grinder. Not a torch. Calculated cuts. Specific load-bearing points. Whoever did this knew exactly where to cut to maximize long-term structural failure without triggering immediate collapse. Gavin was already moving toward the table where he'd left his notes from the contract files. They knew the original engineering specs. Yes. Which means they had internal access. He flipped open the folder. This isn't vandalism. No, Marcus said. It's an operation. He said it quietly, almost to himself. The anonymous text from this morning was still sitting in the forwarded message on his phone. She belongs to us. And now this, not random destruction, but targeted, engineered sabotage. The kind of damage that would reveal itself slowly, weeks or months after the fact, when a floor shifted wrong or a joint failed under load. The kind of damage designed to look like construction error rather than deliberate attack. Designed to destroy the project from within, and designed to be blamed on someone else. Get me the guard's description of anyone he saw before he was hit, Gavin said, and pull every access log for the last 72 hours. Every badge, every contractor ID, every delivery record. You're not officially starting until tomorrow. Then consider this unofficial. He closed the folder. And tell Camille tonight. Not tomorrow. Tonight. There was a brief pause on the line. She's not going to like hearing this at 10 p.m. She's not going to like hearing it at all, Gavin said. The time doesn't matter. He hung up, stood in the kitchen for a moment in the silence that Owen's departure had left behind. Outside, through the small window above the sink, the street was ordinary. A dog walker, a car reversing out of a driveway, the particular mundane motion of a neighborhood going about its Tuesday. The construction worker version of Gavin Holt would have looked at that street and felt something close to peace. The version of him that had read those access logs and heard Marcus Webb's careful, controlled voice was running a different calculation entirely. Whoever was behind this, Brannick, the shell companies, the anonymous text, the shooter in the park, they had just made a significant operational error. They had assumed that what happened at Meadowcrest Park was a setback. They hadn't understood what it actually was. It was an introduction. And Gavin Holt, who had spent 3 years being quietly, deliberately invisible, had just become very visible to exactly the wrong people. He refilled his coffee, sat down at the kitchen table, opened his notebook, and went to work. The first thing Gavin did on his official first morning at Voss Meridian was walk the entire construction site alone. Not with a clipboard, not with an escort. He told Marcus Webb he needed an hour before the crew arrived, and Marcus, who had spent enough time around people who knew what they were doing to recognize when someone did, handed him a site badge and a hard hat and got out of the way. The headquarters expansion occupied a full city block on the east side of Westbridge's downtown corridor. The original building was a 9-story glass and steel structure from the early 2000s that Camille had purchased and renovated 3 years into running Voss Meridian. The expansion was supposed to add a connected 12-story wing. Modern, energy-efficient, designed by an architecture firm out of Denver that had won awards for this kind of work. On paper, it was a clean project, the kind that gets written up in trade publications with words like seamless integration and innovative approach. In reality, it was a mess. Gavin could see it within the first 20 minutes. Not the sabotage specifically, that required documentation and engineering analysis, but the accumulated evidence of a project that had been systematically mismanaged for long enough that the mismanagement had become structural. Wrong-grade concrete in sections that should have used higher spec mix. Rebar spacing that was technically within code but on the absolute minimum edge of it, the kind of tolerance that passed inspection only if the inspector wasn't looking too hard. Change orders taped to site boards with handwritten amendments that should have triggered formal engineering review and hadn't. He stood on the 3rd floor of the East Wing, the section Marcus had described on the phone, the one with the calculated cuts to the load-bearing steel, and looked at the framing. The cuts were subtle. If you didn't know where to look or what you were looking for, they could be mistaken for stress fractures or even imperfections in the original fabrication. But Gavin had spent 12 years in environments where the difference between a structural failure and a solid foundation was sometimes the difference between coming home and not coming home, and he knew what he was looking at. This wasn't accidental. Each cut was placed at a point of maximum load transfer, the exact locations where vertical stress from the floors above would concentrate. Left alone, the structure would hold for months, possibly longer. But under full occupancy load, under the weight of furniture and equipment and people going about their workdays, the failure would eventually come, gradually at first. A crack here, a settling there. And then, if they were unlucky and the timing was wrong, something much worse. He photographed everything with his phone. Measurements, angles, locations relative to the building's grid. He sent everything to an engineering contact he trusted, a woman named Priya Sohn, who had done structural forensics for insurance companies and occasionally for federal investigations, and who owed him a favor from a job 3 years ago when he'd found a foundation problem she'd missed on a report. Then he went to find Dale Brannick. Brannick had an office on the construction management level, a glassed-in space with a view of the site that was clearly designed to project authority. He was a large man, somewhere in his mid-50s, with the particular build of someone who had once been physically imposing and had let it go soft in the middle without losing the habit of taking up space. He had the handshake of a man who thought handshakes were about dominance, which Gavin noted and filed away. "Gavin Holt," Brannick said, leaning back in his chair in a way that was supposed to communicate relaxed confidence. "I've been hearing about you. Good things, I hope." "Depends on who you ask." He smiled. It didn't reach anything. "I'll be straight with you. I've been running this project for 2 years. I know every contractor, every sub, every delivery schedule. I don't really see what's your official title again? Senior Project Consultant. Right. I don't see what a consultant brings to a job this far along that I can't handle myself. Gavin looked at him evenly. Ms. Voss wants fresh eyes on the overruns. That's all. The overruns are a materials market issue. Steel costs, concrete supply chain. You know how it's been since I read the change order logs, Gavin said. All of them, going back 18 months. A small pause. Barely noticeable. And I have some questions about the materials substitutions on floors 3 through 7. The structural steel specification changes, specifically. I'd like to see the original engineering approval documentation for those changes. Brannick's expression didn't shift in any dramatic way. He was too experienced for that. But something recalibrated behind his eyes. A reassessment, a small, careful adjustment. Those are all code compliant, fully inspected. I'm sure they are. I'd still like the documentation. I'll have my assistant pull the files. Today would be good. Brannick smiled again, the same non-smile. Sure. Today. Gavin thanked him and left the office and walked back to the temporary workspace Camille had set up for him on the 4th floor of the main building, a glass-walled room with a long table and access to the project management server. He sat down, opened his laptop, and began building a timeline. He was 3 hours into it when Camille appeared in the doorway. She had meetings all morning. He could tell from the particular tension she carried in her shoulders when she'd been in a room full of people performing careful versions of themselves. She had a coffee in each hand, which was unexpected, and she set one on his table without asking whether he wanted it. Brannick called me, she said, sitting across from him. That was fast. He said you were looking at the change order documentation. He made it sound routine, but Brannick doesn't make routine calls. She wrapped both hands around her own cup. What did you find this morning? Gavin turned his laptop so she could see the photographs from the East Wing framing. He walked her through it without jargon. What the cuts meant, where they were, what would happen over time if they weren't corrected. He watched her face as he talked. She didn't look away from the screen. She didn't interrupt. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. How long have we had people working on those floors? She asked. The subcontractors have been up there daily for 6 weeks. If anyone had been up there when... Yes, he said, because she didn't need to finish the sentence. She set down her coffee. This goes beyond fraud. It was always beyond fraud. The park was beyond fraud. This is someone trying to destroy you systematically. Your company's finances, your physical safety, the safety of the people in this building. He paused. The question is who's directing it. Brannick is executing. Someone is directing. Camille's jaw tightened. She was doing that thing he'd noticed over the past 2 weeks, holding the composure in place through will rather than genuine calm, the way you hold a door shut against wind. It worked, mostly, but he was starting to recognize the moments when the wind picked up. I have a name, she said. I've had it for 3 days and I didn't want to say it until I was sure. Gavin waited. Preston Vale, she said. My former husband. The name landed in the room and stayed there. Tell me, Gavin said. She told him. It took 20 minutes and she did it without sentimentality, which he suspected cost her something. Preston Vale had been her business partner before he was her husband. They'd met when Voss Meridian was still a startup, and he'd come in as a strategic advisor with connections and capital and a particular talent for making himself seem indispensable. They'd married when the company was 3 years old. Maisie was born the following year. The marriage had lasted 5 years and disintegrated badly. Gavin didn't push for details on the personal side of it. He could read enough in the controlled flatness of her voice when she described the end of it. What she did tell him was that Preston had believed, with the particular conviction of someone who had spent years arranging things to his advantage, that he would retain significant influence over Voss Meridian regardless of the divorce. That Camille would need him, that she would eventually understand the company worked better with him than without him. She had not needed him. The company had grown faster without him. He had found this... She paused here, searching for the right word. Difficult. Difficult, Gavin said. He doesn't take being wrong well, she said. And he had never been wrong about anything this significant in his life. When did you start suspecting him? The investigator found the shell companies 2 weeks ago. The parent entity in Nevada traces back to a holding company that Preston used during our marriage for personal investments. It's been restructured and renamed, but the registered agent is the same. She exhaled. I had the investigator confirm it 3 times before I was willing to believe it. And Brannick? Brannick came to Voss Meridian 4 months after Preston left. I hired him on the recommendation of a board member who I later found out played golf with Preston regularly. She said this with the particular tone of someone cataloging their own errors, precisely because it's the only way to stop making them. I didn't connect it at the time. Was the board member aware of what Brannick was doing? I don't think so. I think Preston used him as a reference without explaining why he needed Brannick inside the company. She looked at her coffee. Preston is very good at using people without their knowledge. Gavin turned back to his laptop. The timeline was open, with dates and contracts and names arranged in a sequence that was starting to form a coherent picture. He added Preston Vale's name at the top and ran a line down through Brannick, through the 3 shell companies, through the fraudulent contracts, through the sabotage at the East Wing. Then he added a separate line from Preston's name and ran it to the park, to the shooter, to Calder. He showed her. Calder, she said, and something in her voice shifted in a way that wasn't just about the name. You know him. He's Preston's younger brother. She said it quietly. He's not stable. He never has been. Preston used to manage him, keep him calm, keep him focused on small things, pay his rent, make sure he took his medication. She stopped. Or that's what Preston said he was doing. But I always thought Preston enjoyed it. Having someone that depended on him, someone he could direct. She looked at Gavin's diagram. If Preston stopped managing him, or if he started managing him differently. Pointing him, Gavin said. Yes. The words sat between them like something physical. Gavin closed his laptop. He needed to move, needed to think on his feet rather than sitting still, which had never suited him. He walked to the window and looked down at the construction site below, where the morning crew was arriving, men in hard hats carrying tools. The ordinary machinery of a project that had been built on a foundation of deliberate theft and calculated danger. Preston's goal, he said without turning around. Walk me through what you think he actually wants. Camille was quiet for a moment. Control, she said, of the company. He thinks if he can destabilize the finances enough, undermine the board's confidence in my leadership, demonstrate that the company is in crisis under my management, he can push for a hostile takeover. He has enough investor contacts from our marriage. He's been cultivating them. And if the company collapses instead of being taken over, then he gets nothing. But Preston doesn't plan for failure. He never has. Gavin turned back from the window. He planned for the park. That means he was willing to put Maisie at risk. Her face did something complicated and briefly uncontrolled before settling again. I know. That tells you something about how far he'll go. I know that too. Okay. He pulled out his phone and called Priya Sohn, who picked up on the second ring. The structural engineer had already reviewed his photographs and had a preliminary assessment ready. She'd been up since 4 a.m. working through them, which was exactly the kind of thing Priya did that made her worth every dollar she charged. The cuts were deliberate, she confirmed. Progressive failure timeline was 6 to 18 months under full load. She would have a formal written assessment within 48 hours. After he hung up, he called Detective Marsh. Marsh had been running the investigation into the park shooting with the particular methodical patience of a detective who had learned to distrust quick conclusions, and Gavin had developed a cautious respect for him over the past weeks. He laid out what they had: the shell companies, the Brannick connection, the sabotage, and most importantly, the link between Preston Vale and Calder. Marsh was quiet on the other end for a long moment. You understand that if we move on this before we have enough documentation, Vale's lawyers will bury it. I understand, Gavin said. We need financials. We need paper. The shell companies aren't enough on their own. Brannick's assistant, Gavin said. She's been here 6 months. She's not the one who set this up. She's too new. But she has access to everything Brannick touches. If she's been paying attention, she's seen things. You think she'd talk? I think she looks uncomfortable every time Brannick is in the room. That's not proof of anything, but it's a place to start. He glanced at Camille. Handle it carefully. She's not the target. Marsh agreed to approach her quietly, through proper channels, within the next 48 hours. The next 2 weeks moved in 2 distinct registers simultaneously. On the surface, Voss Meridian's construction project appeared to normalize. Gavin worked with the crew, actually worked, not just observed, and there was a period of adjustment where the experienced contractors weren't sure what to make of him. He was too young for the authority he'd been given, and too practically capable for the consultant title he'd been assigned. He knew how to read structural drawings, and he knew how to use a level, and he knew the difference between a contractor who was cutting corners because he was lazy and one who was doing it because someone had told him to. Within a week, the crew had settled into a workable arrangement. It wasn't their supervisor, technically. But he asked the right questions, and he fixed things without making it about authority, and the men who were good at their jobs, and most of them had nothing to do with Brannick's corruption, responded to that. Brannick watched all of this from his glass-walled office and said nothing, which was, Gavin noted, more disciplined than he'd expected. Beneath the surface, the investigation was building. Priya's formal report landed on a Wednesday, 40 pages of engineering analysis with photographs and load calculations that documented the sabotage in clinical, irrefutable detail. Marcia's conversation with Brannick's assistant, a 26-year-old woman named Elena Torres, had taken 3 careful meetings to produce results. But Elena Torres had indeed been paying attention. She had kept on her personal laptop at home because something had made her uneasy enough to document it. A record of irregular instructions Brannick had given her. Change orders to approve without standard review. Contractor invoices to process through specific accounts. A phone number she'd been told to call if she ever received questions from anyone in legal or finance. A number she'd looked up once out of curiosity and traced to a personal cell phone registered in Nevada. She was scared. But she was also, as Marsh put it when he called Gavin, very angry. The private investigator found the financial trail connecting Brannick's compensation to one of the shell companies, a consulting fee arrangement paid quarterly, routed through 2 intermediary accounts. It wasn't subtle once you knew where to look. It was the kind of financial arrangement that worked only as long as nobody was looking directly at it. Through all of this, Gavin and Camille talked. More than either of them had planned to, more than was strictly necessary for the operational purpose of building a case. It started as briefings, morning updates in the glass-walled room, efficient and focused. But efficiency isn't the only thing that happens when 2 people spend significant time in the same contained situation, working toward the same serious goal. Owen and Maisie had been spending time together too. Camille's house, a substantial place in the hills west of downtown, appropriately secured, with a garden that Maisie occupied the way children occupy spaces that feel genuinely safe, had become a regular stop after school. Gavin had resisted this at first, partly from habit and partly from something he hadn't fully examined yet, an instinct to keep the professional and the personal in separate rooms. But Owen had started laughing again, and Gavin couldn't argue with that. Not the polite, careful laugh of a kid who had learned to perform normalcy. Owen's actual laugh, the one that went a little too loud and snorted slightly at the end. The one Laura had loved because it was completely unmanageable. He heard it one afternoon coming from Maisie's playroom while Gavin and Camille were going over documents in the kitchen, and he stopped talking mid-sentence. Camille heard it too. She looked toward the sound and then looked at Gavin. And the look on her face was something he recognized because he felt the same thing. The particular, complicated relief of watching a child come back to themselves. She hasn't laughed like that since before the park, Camille said quietly. Owen hasn't laughed like that since before his mother died, Gavin said. Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The document sat between them on the kitchen table, unread. It was during one of these evenings at Camille's house that the thing Gavin had been carefully not examining finally made itself impossible to ignore. They were in the kitchen after dinner, Camille at the counter, Gavin at the table, the kids in the next room with a movie. And Camille was telling him about a board meeting she'd navigated that afternoon, a difficult one, a board member who had been Preston's ally making pointed questions about the construction delays. She was telling it as an operational update, the way she usually did. But somewhere in the middle of it, the operational framing slipped and she was just talking, tired and frustrated and human, in a way she didn't usually let herself be when anyone was watching. She stopped herself mid-sentence. Sorry, you don't need the full debrief. I don't mind, Gavin said. She looked at him. He looked back. It was a brief moment, the kind that doesn't announce itself as significant until later. I haven't had, she started and then stopped again. I haven't been able to just talk to someone in a long time. Everyone in my life either reports to me or has an agenda or both. I don't report to you, Gavin said. Technically, I'm a consultant. She almost laughed. You absolutely do not work for me. And I don't have an agenda. I know, she said. And then, more quietly, that's the strange part. He understood what she meant. Not because he was good at this. He wasn't, not particularly. But because he'd spent 3 years being surrounded by people who wanted something from the version of him they thought they knew. The quiet construction worker, the grieving widower, the good neighbor, and Camille Voss in her glass-walled boardroom had somehow managed to locate the version of him that existed before all of those definitions. He didn't say any of that. He wasn't built for that kind of declaration. But he also didn't look away, and neither did she, and sometimes that's enough. It was the following Thursday that everything broke. Gavin was on-site reviewing the corrected framing specifications with the structural crew when his phone rang. Not Marcus. Not Marsh. Owen's school. The secretary's voice was the careful, controlled voice of someone who had been trained to deliver bad news without triggering panic, and she was doing her best. Mr. Holt, I need to let you know, Owen left school at lunch hour. We believed he had permission because there was an adult who... We're trying to understand what happened. We can't locate Owen on campus. The world went very still. Describe the adult, Gavin said. His voice was completely flat. A man, well-dressed, dark hair. He signed Owen out. The signature, a pause. The sound of paper. The signature was a name we didn't recognize, but the release form was filled out correctly, and Gavin was already moving. He was down the stairs and through the side exit before the secretary finished her sentence, his phone to his ear, the other hand pulling up his texts. He called Marcus. He called Marsh. He sent Camille a single text. Owen, school. Someone took him. I'm going. Because he needed her to know, and he couldn't put more words together than that right now. The drive to Owen's school took 4 minutes. He made it in 3. The secretary and the principal were in the front office with the security footage already pulled up on a laptop, and Gavin stood in front of the screen and watched a man he didn't recognize. Dark suit, confident walk, the particular ease of someone accustomed to being allowed entry into places. Sign his son out of school and lead him toward the parking lot. Owen had gone with him, which meant either Owen had been told something reassuring enough that he'd complied, or he'd been given no choice. The footage cut before he could tell which. Is that Preston Vale? Marsh asked from beside him. The detective had made it there in under 8 minutes. No. Gavin studied the screen. Hired. The walk is wrong for someone with a personal stake. He's calm because it's a job. Then Vale is somewhere else. Gavin's phone buzzed. Unknown number. He answered it. Mr. Holt. Preston Vale's voice was measured and pleasant in the way of someone who had rehearsed this. I imagine you're with that detective right now. I want you to know that Owen is fine. He's comfortable, he's been fed, and he will remain perfectly safe as long as you don't do anything that complicates the next few hours. Gavin said nothing. He was aware of Marsh watching him, of the school principal hovering in the background, of the particular mechanical quality his own breathing had taken on. Slow, controlled, the kind that didn't come naturally and had to be chosen. Here's what I need, Preston continued. Camille needs to sign the management transfer documents that my attorneys have prepared. She needs to withdraw the investigation she's been running. Yes, I know about it. I've known for 2 weeks. And she needs to step back from operational control of Voss Meridian. If she does that by 8 o'clock tonight, Owen comes home. If she doesn't, he's 7 years old, Gavin said. A small pause. I understand that. You understand that? He kept his voice very level. Then you understand that whatever you think this achieves for you, you've made a decision tonight that has no good ending for you. I want you to think carefully about that. Is that a threat, Mr. Holt? It's information, Gavin said. Use it however you want. He hung up. Marsh was already on his radio. The call had been long enough for a partial trace. Not a location, but a cell tower sector on the northeast edge of the city, an industrial area. Marsh had 3 units moving toward it within 90 seconds. Camille arrived at the school 11 minutes after Gavin's text. She came fast, one SUV, Marcus driving, and she was out of the vehicle before it fully stopped. Her face was controlled in a way that Gavin recognized as costing her everything she had. "Tell me," she said. He told her. All of it, including Preston's demands. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for 3 seconds. He counted, and then said, "I'm not signing anything." "I know." He thought I would. She said it with something that wasn't quite contempt, but was close to it. "After everything he's done, he thought I would fold because—" She stopped. "He doesn't know you." "No," Gavin said. "He doesn't." Marsh came back across the room with an update. The cell tower data pointed to a cluster of warehouses near the rail yard off North Cutler Road. Abandoned facilities, mostly. A private investigator working for the legal team had pulled city records on one of them, a former equipment storage facility, registered to a company that dissolved 8 months ago, but whose lease had been renewed quietly through a third party. Preston Vale's third party. One of the Nevada shell companies. Gavin looked at Marsh. Covert approach. If he sees a police column coming, he panics, and that's bad for Owen. "I know how to run this," Marsh said, not unkindly. "I know you do. I'm going with you." Marsh started to object. "He has my son," Gavin said simply. A pause. "You stay behind the perimeter until we've secured the location." Agreed. It wasn't a comfortable agreement, and both of them knew it wasn't a promise, but it was enough to move forward. The drive to North Cutler Road took 12 minutes with 2 unmarked units running quiet. No lights, no sirens, nothing that would announce their approach to anyone watching the access road. Camille came. Gavin didn't argue about it. He would have done the same. The warehouse district off North Cutler was the kind of place that accumulated in post-industrial cities like sediment, buildings that had served purposes that no longer existed, concrete and corrugated steel slowly returning to the landscape. Most of them were dark. One of them had a thin line of light visible through the gap at the bottom of a side door. Marsh's teams positioned quietly, efficiently, the way people move when the stakes are high enough to make speed secondary to precision. Gavin stayed at the designated perimeter point with Camille and Marcus. He knew the layout from the building records. Single floor, high ceiling, 2 access points, a row of old storage units along the eastern wall that would provide cover for anyone inside. He stood at the perimeter and felt the particular, excruciating discipline of staying still when everything in him wanted to move. Then, from inside, muffled by the corrugated walls, "Dad!" Owen's voice. Gavin was moving before the sound finished. Not running, not a flat charge. The controlled, direct movement of someone who had done this in places where doing it wrong meant not coming back. He covered the distance to the side entrance in seconds. Hit the door with his shoulder at the same moment that one of Marsh's units hit the main entrance, and was inside before anyone had time to process the breach. The interior was lit by 2 portable work lights set up near the middle of the space. Preston Vale was there, thinner than his photographs, with the slightly overgroomed quality of a man who managed his appearance precisely because it was one of the things he could control. He was standing 10 feet from Owen, who had been seated on an upturned plastic crate with his hands zip-tied in front of him. The man from the school footage was near the far wall. Preston turned when the door came open. His composure held for approximately 1 second, which was impressive given the circumstances. "This isn't—" he started. Gavin crossed to Owen in 4 steps, got between the boy and Preston, and with the calm deliberateness of someone who had performed this motion in his muscle memory for 12 years, pulled Owen behind him and checked the zip tie. Plastic, standard, front-tied, hands visible. Not dangerous restraint, more theatrical than functional. He snapped it with the twist that Owen didn't even feel. "Dad." Owen's voice was smaller than usual, and then less small, and then he grabbed the back of Gavin's jacket with both hands and held on. "I've got you," Gavin said. "Stay behind me." Preston was talking, demanding something, the words coming faster now, as the police units poured through the main entrance, and the man from the school footage made the extremely poor decision to step toward the action rather than away from it, and was immediately tackled by 2 officers. Preston kept talking even as Marsh's people surrounded him, the practiced lawyerly reflex of a man who had always managed situations through the authority of his own voice and couldn't immediately locate the switch to turn it off. "You have no right. This is a private facility. I want my attorney." "Preston." Camille's voice came from behind Gavin. She had come through the main entrance with Marcus. and she stood in the middle of the warehouse with her hands at her sides and looked at the man she had once married with an expression Gavin couldn't fully read from where he stood. It wasn't hatred, it wasn't fear, it was something more tired and more final than either of those things. "It's done," she said. "Stop talking." Preston looked at her. The momentum of his words ran out. The police handcuffed him while he stood there, and he didn't resist, and Gavin thought that was perhaps the most honest thing Preston Vale had done in years, recognizing finally that the room had shifted in a way he couldn't manage or negotiate. Gavin turned to Owen. The boy was 7 years old and had zip ties on his wrists 20 minutes ago and was now standing in a warehouse surrounded by police officers and portable work lights. And his face was doing several things simultaneously, processing shock, refusing tears, trying to determine whether it was safe to be scared now that the immediate thing was over. "Hey," Gavin said quietly, crouching down. "You okay?" Owen looked at him carefully, the way he looked at things when he was deciding something. "Were you scared?" he asked. "Yes," Gavin said. Owen said, "Me too." He looked around the warehouse, then back at his father. "I didn't tell him anything. He kept asking me questions about you, and I said I didn't know." "What kind of questions?" "Like, what you did before construction, whether you talked about Camille at home." He frowned slightly. "I said you didn't talk much at all about anything, which is mostly true." Gavin looked at his son for a long moment. "That's exactly right." "I know." Owen glanced toward Preston, who was being walked toward the main entrance by 2 officers. His expression was unreadable for a 7-year-old. He kept saying everything was going to be fine. He had the same voice as the people at school when they're telling you something bad and trying to make it not sound bad. "You didn't believe him?" "No." Owen looked back at his father. "He didn't sound like someone telling the truth. He sounded like someone who needed you to believe him." He paused. "There's a difference." Gavin said nothing for a moment. He was thinking about the fact that his 7-year-old son had just articulated something that took most adults decades to learn, and that he had learned it in the worst possible classroom. "Yeah," he said, "there is." He pulled Owen into him and held on. Owen let himself be held, which at 7 years old he sometimes did, and sometimes refused on principle. And tonight he did it without protest, without embarrassment, with the straightforward need of a kid who had needed his father close for several hours, and was finally getting that. Across the warehouse, Camille stood watching them. Gavin didn't see her face clearly from where he was. But Maisie, who had somehow also appeared, Marcus had been with her at the car, and she had apparently been extraordinarily persuasive about coming inside, stood beside her mother and slipped her hand into Camille's. Camille looked down at her daughter. She looked back at Gavin and Owen, and the expression on her face was one that had nothing to do with control or composure or the management of difficult situations. It was something much simpler and much harder than any of those things. Gavin saw it. He didn't say anything about it, but he saw it, and he held his son. And outside the warehouse, the sirens were starting up, and the night was cold and clear, and the stars over Westbridge were the same stars they'd always been, indifferent and bright, doing what stars do regardless of what happens beneath them. Preston Vale was put into the back of a police vehicle, still in his expensive suit, and the door closed on him with a sound that was entirely ordinary, just a car door, just a latch, but that contained in it the end of something that had been building for a long time. Gavin heard it from inside the warehouse. He didn't look up. He already knew what it meant. The arraignment happened on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon the story had moved beyond the local news cycle and into the kind of coverage that required a media strategy. Camille had one. She'd been preparing it for 2 weeks, not because she'd known the arrest was coming on that particular Friday, but because she was the kind of person who prepared for contingencies before they became necessities. Her communications director, a compact, fast-talking woman named Diane Chu, who had been with Voss Meridian for 4 years and had the particular metabolism of someone who ran on urgency and strong coffee, had a statement ready within 2 hours of Preston's booking. It was measured, factual, and said precisely enough to establish the company's position without saying anything that could complicate the prosecution. Gavin read it over Camille's shoulder in her office, while Diane hovered near the door waiting for approval. He didn't have suggestions. It was good. Camille approved it, Diane disappeared to send it, and then the office was quiet in the way offices get quiet when the immediate crisis has passed and the longer, slower work of consequence begins. "How are you?" Gavin asked. Camille was standing at the window, looking at the construction site below. She'd been at the window a lot lately. He'd noticed it over the past weeks, the way she oriented herself toward the site when she needed to think, as though watching people build things was a form of steadying. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "Ask me in a week." "Fair." She turned from the window. "Owen, how is he?" "He went to school this morning," Gavin said. "He asked for the diagonal sandwich again, which I'm taking as a good sign." Something softened in her face. "Did he sleep?" "Better than I did." She looked at him carefully. "What about you?" He considered deflecting, which was his default, and then decided against it. "I keep running the warehouse in my head. The timeline from the school call to when we got there, trying to find where it could have gone differently." "It didn't go differently. He was fine." "I know that. I'm telling you what my brain does with it anyway." He pulled out a chair at her conference table and sat down. "It's a habit. After an operation, you run the debrief even when it went right. Especially when it went right, because right doesn't mean it couldn't have gone wrong." She sat across from him. "Does it help?" "Not really, but it's harder to stop than to keep going." She nodded slowly. "I do the same thing with board meetings. I'll be lying awake at midnight, going through every exchange, every facial expression, trying to find the thing I missed or said wrong." She paused. "My therapist calls it catastrophizing in reverse, like you're preparing for a disaster that already didn't happen." "You have a therapist?" "You say that like it's surprising." "It is, a little." She raised an eyebrow. "Why?" "You're very contained." "Contained people are exactly the ones who need therapists," she said, "because all that containment has to go somewhere." He thought about that for a moment. "Yeah, fair point." The week that followed was the kind of week that existed entirely in documentation and legal process. The grinding, unglamorous machinery of accountability that looks nothing like the dramatic moments that precede it. Preston's attorneys moved immediately and aggressively, filing motions to suppress the evidence from Elena Torres, on the grounds that her personal documentation of Brannick's instructions constituted improper record-keeping, a position that the prosecuting attorney's office dismantled methodically and without apparent effort. Dale Brannick lasted 11 days before he called the prosecutor's office directly, without going through his own attorney, which his attorney later described as the worst decision of the entire case and possibly of Brannick's life. He wanted a deal. He wanted it badly enough that he was willing to provide detailed financial records, internal communications, and a complete accounting of every fraudulent contract, every staged insurance claim, and every construction substitution that he and Preston had engineered over 3 years. Gavin heard about the call from Marsh, who relayed it with the careful neutrality of a detective who had learned not to express satisfaction in outcomes until they were fully secured. "He gave up everything," Marsh said. "Names, dates, amounts, the shell company structure, the Nevada holding company. He even identified the contractor who cut the framing on the east wing, a sub that Brannick had brought in specifically for that job, someone with a prior fraud conviction in another state that should have disqualified him from the site entirely." "What does Brannick want in return?" Gavin asked. "Reduced charges. He's looking at fraud, conspiracy, and construction sabotage. With full cooperation, he's probably looking at 8 to 12 rather than 15 to 20. "And Preston?" "Preston's position just got significantly worse." Marsh paused. "There's something else. Calder, Preston's brother. His court-appointed psychiatrist has been working with him for 3 weeks. He's been stabilized on medication, and he's been communicative." Gavin waited. "He recorded phone calls," Marsh said. "Apparently he was paranoid enough about Preston's instructions to keep records of them. Voice memos on his phone going back 14 months. Preston directing him, building on whatever was already unstable in his thinking, feeding him specific information about Camille's schedule, Maisie's routine, her security patterns." The silence on Gavin's end lasted several seconds. He recorded them. 47 separate recordings. Preston's voice, clearly identified, giving his brother operational details about Camille Voss while simultaneously presenting himself publicly as the concerned sibling managing a difficult family member. Gavin exhaled slowly. "That's everything." "That's everything," Marsh confirmed. "Vale's attorneys are going to have a very unpleasant week." They did. Preston's lead attorney, a silver-haired man named Kaufman, who had a reputation built on making complicated financial crimes seem abstract enough to confuse juries, held a press conference on Tuesday in which he described his client as a concerned former spouse who had taken misguided actions out of genuine worry for his daughter's well-being. The statement was precisely crafted and would have been effective in a different case, with different evidence. It was not effective in this case. The recordings made it untenable within 48 hours, and Kaufman pivoted to a strategy of attacking the witnesses rather than defending the facts, which told Gavin everything he needed to know about how Kaufman assessed his own client's position. The attack on Gavin came during a preliminary hearing in the fourth week. He'd been called to provide a statement about his observations at the construction site, the sabotage, the structural analysis, the chain of evidence leading to Brannock. It was straightforward testimony. He'd given more complicated accounts in military after-action reviews with significantly higher stakes, and he wasn't nervous. Kaufman cross-examined him for 40 minutes. The attorney's approach was methodical and had clearly been prepared with access to Gavin's background check, which meant Preston's people had been thorough, had found the military records, had assembled a narrative. The narrative Kaufman presented was this. Gavin Holt was a former special operations soldier who had inserted himself into a billionaire's life under the guise of heroism, leveraged that access to obtain a powerful position within her company, and had then conducted what amounted to a private intelligence operation against her former husband while developing a personal relationship with the woman whose decisions controlled the investigation. It was not an incompetent argument. Stripped of context and specificity, it had a shape that could be made to look plausible to someone who didn't know the actual sequence of events. Kaufman stood at the lectern and made it with the smooth, unhurried confidence of a man who had delivered uncomfortable arguments in comfortable shoes for 30 years. Isn't it true, Mr. Holt, that you accepted a position of significant authority within Voss Meridian Technologies within weeks of meeting Ms. Voss? Yes, Gavin said. And isn't it true that this position gave you access to confidential financial records, contractor agreements, and internal communications? Yes, and that you used this access to conduct your own investigation, parallel to but separate from the official police investigation? I shared everything I found with Detective Marsh in real time, Gavin said. The investigation was not parallel, it was coordinated. But you gathered the initial evidence. You made the initial assessments. You decided what was relevant. I have 15 years of construction experience and a background in reconnaissance operations. Ms. Voss hired me because that combination was relevant to understanding what was happening on the site. Everything I found was documented and turned over. Kaufman paused for a moment. The practiced pause of a cross-examiner who wants the previous answer to sit in the air long enough to seem like an admission. You were also, during this period, developing a personal relationship with Ms. Voss. We worked together, Gavin said. We were in contact regularly because the situation required it. A personal relationship, Kaufman repeated, as though Gavin hadn't spoken. I heard the question. Then I'll ask it plainly. Are you and Camille Voss romantically involved? The courtroom was quiet. Gavin looked at Kaufman directly. That's not relevant to the structural integrity of the East Wing framing or to Dale Brannock's signed change orders. I'll determine what's relevant, Kaufman said. Please answer the question. We worked together, Gavin said. What that may or may not become in the future is not something I'll discuss in this room. Kaufman let that sit for a moment, then shifted direction. Mr. Holt, you initially rejected Ms. Voss's offer of $100,000 after the incident at the park. Yes, but you subsequently accepted a position that provides you significant compensation and career advancement. I accepted a job I'm qualified for, and that needed to be done. The compensation is appropriate to the role. You went from construction worker to senior executive within a billion-dollar company in under 6 weeks. The title is Senior Project Consultant. I oversee construction operations. Gavin kept his voice level. I didn't write the title. I do the work. And why did you take a bullet for a child you'd never met? Kaufman asked, and the sudden shift in tone, from lawyer's precision to something almost conversational, was deliberate. It was a technique. Make the witness adjust, look for the unguarded moment. Gavin looked at him. Then he looked across the room, to where Maisie was seated in the gallery beside Owen, both of them watching with the particular concentrated attention of children who understand they are witnessing something important without fully understanding what. He looked back at Kaufman. "She was 6 years old," Gavin said. "That's why." The answer arrived in the courtroom without elaboration, without performance, without anything attached to it except the plain fact of it. Kaufman waited for more. There wasn't more. Gavin had said the thing, and the thing was complete, and no follow-up question Kaufman constructed in the next 20 seconds improved his position enough to ask it. He moved on. Gavin left the stand 40 minutes later. He sat in the gallery beside Owen, who immediately and without apparent self-consciousness put his hand into Gavin's, which Owen only did now when something had mattered to him and he wanted to mark it without saying so. Gavin held his son's hand and watched the proceedings, and didn't think about Kaufman's questions, or his own answers, or the way the narrative had been assembled against him. He thought instead about the morning he'd walked Owen to the bus stop, and Owen had said, unprompted, that he thought Maisie was probably the best friend he'd ever had, and the careful way he'd said it, like he was testing whether it was okay to say something that meant that much. Gavin had said it sounded right to him. Owen had nodded and gotten on the bus. That was 3 weeks ago. It felt like something that had always been true. The trial itself, when it came, lasted 11 days. Preston Vale sat at the defense table in a suit that probably cost more than Gavin's truck and maintained throughout the proceedings the particular expression of a man who was still, at some level, convinced that the situation was manageable. It was the expression of someone who had never been truly cornered and couldn't fully accept that the walls were real. His composure was impressive in a technical sense. He never lost his temper, never made a visible mistake, never gave the prosecution the emotional reaction they might have used. He was, Gavin thought, watching him from the gallery on the 4th day, genuinely convinced of his own rightness in a way that no amount of evidence was going to reach. That was ultimately Preston's problem. Not the evidence against him, though it was overwhelming. Not Brannock's cooperation, though it was comprehensive. Not even Calder's recordings, though they were devastating. His problem was that he had organized his entire understanding of the situation around a version of reality in which he was the central figure making justified decisions, and the trial required him to sit in a room and watch that version dismantled piece by piece without being able to rearrange it. Elena Torres testified on the 6th day. She was 26 years old and visibly nervous, and told the truth in a straightforward, unembellished way that juries respond to because it sounds like someone telling the truth rather than performing it. She described Brannock's instructions with specific dates and specific language, read from the notes she'd kept on her personal laptop, and answered Kaufman's cross-examination in monosyllables that consistently refused to give him anything to work with. Priya Sohn testified on the 8th day, 40 pages of structural engineering analysis condensed into 60 minutes of testimony delivered with the calm authority of someone whose opinion was grounded in physics rather than interpretation. She explained, in terms accessible enough for a lay jury without being condescending, what the deliberate cuts to the east wing framing would have produced. She used visual aids, photographs, load diagrams, failure progression models. When Kaufman challenged her methodology, she answered each challenge with the patience of someone who had been challenged by smarter people in higher stakes settings and had always had the same answer. The math was the math. The recordings came in on day 9. Preston's attorneys made 3 motions to exclude them and lost all 3. The jury heard 47 recordings in edited summary, key excerpts played in sequence. Preston's voice, calm, deliberate, the same measured tone he used at the defense table, feeding his unstable brother precise operational details about Camille's security arrangements. And then, in the later recordings, something darker. Encouragement. Not explicit instruction, but the kind of encouragement that someone in Calder's mental state would receive as instruction. The careful architecture of a man who wanted something done and wanted the distance to claim he hadn't done it. The jury was out for 6 hours. Gavin didn't wait at the courthouse. He took Owen home, made dinner, pasta, which Owen had declared his preference over everything else during what he called the warehouse week, and which had become a Thursday tradition by some logic Gavin hadn't tracked. And they ate at the kitchen table and talked about Owen's soccer season, which was going well enough that the coach had moved him to a different position that suited him better. The cut to the left had finally come together. Not perfectly, but reliably, which was better. The verdict came through on Marcia's call at 7:43 p.m. Gavin was washing dishes. Owen was doing homework at the table. Guilty on all primary counts. Kidnapping, financial conspiracy, construction sabotage, and child endangerment. Brannick, pursuant to his cooperation agreement, pleaded to reduce charges. The contractor who had cut the East Wing framing was convicted separately. Calder was remanded to a long-term psychiatric facility under court supervision, a proceeding handled in a separate hearing that the press covered less intensively, but that Camille attended in full because she had asked to, because she had wanted to see it concluded. Gavin thanked Marsh and hung up. He finished the dishes, put the last plate in the rack, dried his hands on the kitchen towel. Owen looked up from his homework. Was that about the trial? Yes. What happened? He's going to prison, Gavin said simply, for a long time. Owen looked at him steadily for a moment. He was processing it, Gavin could see, running it through whatever system a 7-year-old uses to integrate significant information. Is it done? He asked finally. Like, all of it? Yeah, Gavin said. All of it. Owen nodded slowly, looked back at his homework, wrote something. Then, can we call Maisie and tell her? Gavin looked at his son. She was scared too, Owen said without looking up. She should know. He called Camille's number. She answered on the second ring, and he could hear in the half-second before she spoke that she'd been waiting. Not impatiently, but the way you wait for something when you've been holding your breath for so long you've stopped noticing. Marsh called you, she said. Just now. Owen wanted Maisie to know. A brief pause. Then Camille's voice, directed away from the phone. Maisie, come here. And then the small sound of Maisie's footsteps, and Camille saying quietly that it was over, that the bad man was going away for a very long time and wasn't coming back. And then Maisie's voice, muffled, asking something. And then Owen, leaning across the table toward Gavin's phone. Maisie, it's okay. My dad says it's really done. Gavin held the phone between them and let the kids talk. Camille's voice came through again after a minute, directed at him this time. Thank you, she said. Owen's idea, he said. I know. A pause. That kid. Yeah. The silence that followed was comfortable in a way that silences between two people only become after a lot of uncomfortable ones. Camille broke it first. Gavin. Yeah. Can I say something without you deflecting it? He considered the question seriously, because she deserved that. Probably not, but you can try. He heard her exhale. Not quite a laugh, but close. You rebuilt this. Not just the building, all of it. When you walked onto that site and started pulling change order logs, you didn't have any stake in it except that I asked. You didn't have to. I had a stake in it, he said. What stake? He was quiet for a moment. Owen and Maisie were still talking, Owen explaining soccer positions with the particular earnestness of a 7-year-old who has recently discovered he is good at something and wants to share the discovery in full. Outside the kitchen window, the street was ordinary and quiet, the same street it had always been. Someone had already tried to kill your daughter, Gavin said. That made it mine. She didn't respond immediately. He wasn't sure what he expected her to say. He wasn't sure what he'd meant by it entirely, whether it was a professional statement or a personal one, or something that didn't fit neatly into either category because it had started as one thing and become another while he wasn't watching. Okay, she said finally, quietly. Okay, he agreed. They stayed on the phone for another few minutes while the kids talked themselves to a natural stopping point, which happened when Maisie announced she was going to draw a picture to celebrate, and Owen said he wanted to see it, and Maisie said she would bring it on Saturday, and Owen said okay. After they hung up, Owen put his pencil down and sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling with the expression of someone who has reached a decision. Dad, he said. What? I think we should move to a bigger place. Gavin looked at him. We're fine here. We're fine, Owen agreed, in the tone of someone who has accepted fine but considers it an intermediate state. But Maisie's house has a garden. Maisie's house is Maisie's house. I know. Owen looked at the ceiling again. I'm just saying, hypothetically. Gavin was quiet for a moment. Hypothetically. Yeah. Go finish your homework. Owen picked his pencil back up. But he was almost smiling, which he did when he'd said the thing he meant to say, and it had landed the way he'd intended. He was 7 years old, and he had, apparently, opinions about housing arrangements and the importance of gardens. Gavin went back to the dishes and thought about the fact that his son was smarter than him in ways that were only going to become more obvious over time. The following Monday, Gavin walked the East Wing with the structural repair team, a new crew, properly vetted, brought in to correct the damage Brannick's contractor had done. Priya Sohn was on site to supervise the engineering side. The repair work would take 6 weeks, add legitimate cost to the project, and push the completion timeline by approximately 2 months. Under the circumstances, Camille had described this as a small miracle of project management. She wasn't wrong. Given what the building had been used for, as a vehicle for fraud, as an instrument of sabotage, as a mechanism designed to destroy the company from within, the fact that it was going to be completed at all was a kind of victory that didn't announce itself with drama. It just proceeded, one corrected beam at a time, toward the thing it had always been supposed to become. Gavin liked that. The work, the precision of it, the way a building didn't care about the drama surrounding its construction and simply required correct materials installed at correct angles, with sufficient structural integrity to stand. It was honest in a way that the previous months had rarely been, and he was glad to be back in it. He was reviewing the upper floor framing specs with the lead contractor, a methodical man named Greg Tanner who had been in commercial construction for 25 years and had an allergy to shortcuts that Gavin found professionally refreshing. When Camille appeared on the floor, hard hat on, which she wore with the slightly self-conscious air of someone who was aware it didn't suit her, but had decided that safety requirements applied to everyone, including CEOs. She stood beside him and looked at the repaired framing, the new steel bright against the older structure. "Better?" she asked. "Much," Gavin said. Tanner moved discreetly to the other end of the floor to give them space, which Gavin noted with mild amusement. Construction workers had their own social intelligence, and the situation between himself and Camille Voss was apparently legible to people who worked with both of them, even if neither of them had formally acknowledged it. "I had a call with the board this morning," Camille said. "The Membership Oversight Subcommittee. They wanted a full briefing on the investigation and the trial outcome." "How did it go?" "Better than any board meeting I've had in 2 years," she said, which isn't as high a bar as it sounds, given what the last 2 years involved. She pulled off the hard hat and pushed her hair back. "The board member who recommended Brannick has resigned. The other 2 who were adjacent to Preston's investor circle are distancing themselves as fast as institutional dignity allows." "And the ones who aren't?" "The ones who aren't are relieved, I think, genuinely." She looked at the framing again. The company was in real trouble. Not collapsing, but genuinely stressed in ways that were going to matter if they continued. I think the board had been aware something was wrong for longer than they admitted, and not knowing the source was making them nervous. Now they know, and it's been removed, and I think they're ready to work. "Good. I'm also promoting Marcus Webb to Chief Security Officer," she said, "which I should have done a year ago. He managed this entire situation with a level of professionalism that I didn't fully appreciate until I was watching it from inside it." "He's good," Gavin agreed. "He is." She was quiet for a moment, looking at the construction floor. "And I want to talk to you about your role, officially, not the consulting arrangement. You want to make it permanent. I want to offer you a permanent position, yes. Director of Facilities and Construction Operations. It's a real title with a real scope, oversight of the headquarters, future projects, vendor relationships, the infrastructure portfolio." She said it straightforwardly, without the persuasive framing she'd used when she first recruited him. More like she was stating a thing that was already obvious and simply needed to be said. "You've earned it. Not because of the park, because of the work." Gavin looked at the steel, thought about Tanner at the other end of the floor, about Priya's 40-page report, about the 3 months of 6 a.m. mornings and late nights, and the particular satisfaction of watching a project get corrected from the inside out. "I need to think about it," he said. "I know. I'm not being difficult." "I know that too." She put the hard hat back on. "Think about it as long as you need." He did think about it. He thought about it for 4 days, which was longer than he usually needed to make decisions because the question wasn't really about the job. He was good at the job. He wanted the job. The job was right for him in the way that some things are right in a way that doesn't require extensive deliberation. The real question was the one underneath the job offer, the one neither of them had said in the courtroom or on the phone the night of the verdict or in any of the dozens of conversations they'd had in the past 3 months. The question of what was building between them alongside the building they were repairing, and whether he was ready for it, and whether readiness was even the right framework, because he hadn't been ready for Owen to start laughing again either, and Owen had started laughing anyway. He called Camille on the 4th evening. "I'll take the job," he said. "Good," she said. And then, "That's not the only thing you're saying yes to, is it?" It wasn't a question exactly. "No," he said. "Probably not." Another pause, the kind she let sit when she was choosing her words carefully. "I don't know what this looks like," she said. "The two of us. The kids. All of it. I don't have a plan for it." "Neither do I." "I'm usually the one with a plan." "I know." He thought about the park, about the way she'd stood in the park and looked at Maisie after it was over, about the plastic chair in the hospital waiting room that she'd occupied for 4 hours because Owen needed someone there. "I think this one we figure out as we go." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not very good at figuring out as I go." "I know," he said. "You're better at it than you think." She said nothing for a beat. Then, "Maisie drew that picture, the celebration picture she told Owen about." "What did she draw?" 4 people, Camille said. 2 tall and 2 short, standing in a garden. A pause. "She labeled them." He waited. "She wrote our names," Camille said. "All 4 of us. And then she wrote underneath, she spelled it wrong, but you can tell what it is. She wrote the word family." Gavin stood in the kitchen of the house on Alder Street in the silence that followed. Outside, the street was the same street it had always been. Inside, the refrigerator hummed and the screen door spring was still broken and Owen's soccer cleats were by the door, precisely parallel. Nothing looked different. Everything was. "She'll be mortified about the spelling when she's older," Gavin said. He heard Camille laugh. A real one. Not the careful almost laugh she sometimes used as a placeholder for the real thing. This was the real thing, with the ragged edge of someone who had been holding a lot for a long time, and had finally found a moment to put some of it down. "She will," Camille agreed, absolutely mortified. He held his phone and listened to her laugh, and thought about a 6-year-old girl with her hands pressed against his wound in a park, and a 7-year-old boy doing his homework at a kitchen table, and the particular stubbornness it took to keep going when going required more than you thought you had, and the fact that sometimes the thing that saves you looks like the last thing you expected. Maisie had spelled family wrong, but she'd known exactly what she was drawing. The guest house sat at the back of Camille's property, separated from the main house by a stone path and a row of Japanese maples that had turned deep red by November. Gavin and Owen had moved in 6 weeks after the verdict, which was Camille's suggestion, and Gavin's reluctant agreement, and Owen's complete and immediate enthusiasm, expressed through the kind of energetic opinion-having that 7-year-olds apply to arrangements they consider obviously correct. Owen had strong views about which room he wanted, views that aligned perfectly with the room Maisie had already mentally assigned him, a coincidence that neither child found surprising. The guest house was smaller than the Alder Street rental by about 400 square feet, which meant Gavin had put half his furniture in storage and simplified in ways that turned out not to bother him. A man who had lived out of a pack in environments considerably less hospitable than a well-appointed guest house in the hills west of Westbridge could manage a smaller living room. Owen had not inherited this particular adaptability and had opinions about closet space that were disproportionate to his wardrobe, but these were resolved through the discovery that the guest house had a second storage closet that nobody had mentioned during the walkthrough, and the matter was considered closed. The first month had a learning curve that nobody talked about explicitly, but everyone navigated in real time. Gavin was not a person accustomed to proximity. 3 years of deliberate isolation had made him careful about space, his own and others, in ways that were largely invisible until they weren't. He liked mornings quiet. He cooked by himself. He had a particular way of organizing the kitchen that was not objectively better than any other way but was his, and it had been his alone for long enough that finding Camille in the guest house kitchen on a Saturday morning, making coffee in a pot she'd brought from the main house because she'd run out of her preferred brand, and could she just, had required a specific internal adjustment. He made the adjustment. These things take practice. Camille, for her part, was accustomed to running things. Not in a domineering way. She'd worked hard enough at her own edges to know that tendency and manage it, but in the practical sense of someone who had been making every significant decision about her life and her daughter's life alone for long enough that collaboration required a kind of deliberate gear shift she sometimes forgot to make. She scheduled things. She had opinions about how the stone path between the houses should be maintained. She sent Gavin articles about structural engineering innovations at 6 in the morning with brief notes that said things like interesting application for the new project, which was either professional communication or companionable habit or both. And after a while, it didn't matter which category it belonged to because it had simply become part of how mornings worked. They were imperfect at it. They argued twice in the first month, once about a decision Gavin made regarding the headquarters project without looping her in, which he'd considered operational and she'd considered something that warranted a conversation, and once about a conversation she'd had with Owen's school counselor without telling Gavin first, which she'd considered supportive and he'd considered an overreach. Both arguments were uncomfortable, both arguments were resolved, and both left behind a thin residue of useful information about the other person that they filed away and drew on going forward. Maisie adapted to the new arrangement with the radical pragmatism of a 6-year-old who had decided that something was good and had no patience for excessive deliberation about it. Owen was there. Owen's dad made better pancakes than anyone she had ever met, which she announced at breakfast one Sunday with the gravity of an official judgment. The garden was now used by people she liked. These were improvements, and she cataloged them with satisfaction and moved on. Owen, for his part, had a few weeks of quiet adjustment that Gavin watched carefully without commenting on. The boy processed things slowly and internally, always had, even before Laura died, and even more so after. He went about the new arrangement observantly, noting things, testing the texture of daily life against some internal calibration that Gavin didn't have access to and had learned not to push. About 5 weeks in, on a Wednesday evening after dinner, Owen sat at the kitchen table in the guest house doing homework while Gavin reviewed project documents, and without looking up from his worksheet, Owen said, "I think this is good." Gavin looked at him. "Which part?" "All of it," Owen said, still not looking up. "Being here. Maisie. Camille." He wrote something. "I thought it would feel weird. It doesn't." Gavin set down his pen. "How does it feel?" Owen considered this with the seriousness he brought to questions that mattered. "Like when something fits right," he said finally. "Like the shoes that don't hurt." Gavin looked at his son for a long moment. "Yeah," he said. "That's a good way to put it." Owen nodded once, satisfied, and went back to his worksheet. The headquarters expansion completed in the 3rd week of March, 4 months behind the original schedule and 11% under the revised budget that Gavin had set when he'd taken over the project. It was not a perfect number. The delays were real, and the cost of correcting Brannick's sabotage had been substantial. But it was honest, and honest numbers after years of falsified ones had their own kind of value that was difficult to put in a spreadsheet. The building was good. Gavin knew it was good the way he knew a wall was plumb, not from looking at it once, but from the accumulated certainty of having been inside every floor, reviewed every joint, approved every major installation. The structure was sound. The materials were what they were supposed to be. When people moved in and went about their work and stopped thinking about the building as a building and started thinking about it as the place where they spent their days, it would hold them properly. He stood on the 12th floor on the day the final inspection was signed off. A clear morning in late March, snow still on the ridgelines north of the city, but the valley warming, and looked out through the completed glass curtain wall at Westbridge below. The park was visible from this angle. Meadowcrest, with the soccer field on the far side and the playground equipment near the eastern boundary. From 12 floors up, the distance he'd covered that September afternoon looked different than it had from ground level. Shorter, somehow, which he understood intellectually, the brain collapses retrospective distances, but which still struck him. Greg Tanner came to stand beside him. The contractor had been on this project for 3 months, had put in the kind of work that doesn't call attention to itself because it's simply correct, and had the quiet satisfaction of a craftsman who knows the thing he built will last. "Good building," Tanner said. "Good building," Gavin agreed. They looked at it for a moment. "You know," Tanner said, "when they first brought me in, I thought this was going to be one of those jobs, the kind where everything's already too broken to fix right." It was close. Yeah. Tanner rubbed the back of his neck. But you can usually tell whether something's too far gone or whether it just needs someone to start from the actual problem instead of the symptom. He looked at the floor. Most people want to fix the symptom. It's faster. Gavin thought about that. It's always faster, he said, until it isn't. Tanner nodded. They shook hands, and Tanner left, and Gavin stayed on the 12th floor a while longer with the city spread below him and the scar on his left side, and the particular knowledge that some things break and can still be made right, and some things break and make room for something better. And the difference between those two outcomes is almost never visible from the outside, and almost always comes down to whether somebody was willing to stand in the broken place long enough to understand it. The children's presentation happened on a Saturday afternoon in early April, which was, by any measure, the strangest and most effective piece of negotiation Gavin had encountered in his adult life. He and Camille had been in the main house kitchen, Gavin reading, Camille working through email on her laptop, the companionable co-occupation of two people who had become comfortable with each other's silences. When Owen appeared in the doorway with a very specific expression. It was his prepared expression, the one he deployed when he'd thought carefully about something and was ready to present it, which Gavin had seen most recently when Owen had lobbied successfully for a later weeknight bedtime on the basis of a written argument that had included, inexplicably but somehow effectively, a chart. There was a chart this time too. Maisie stood behind him, slightly to his left, with the posture of someone who has agreed to let the other person lead but is prepared to take over if necessary. We need to talk to you both, Owen said. Gavin and Camille exchanged a look. Okay, Camille said carefully. Should we be worried? No, Owen said. Sit down, though. They sat. Owen produced, from behind his back, several sheets of paper that had been stapled together with the particular conviction of someone who believed in proper document management. The cover page read, in Owen's best handwriting, Why You Should Get Married, a report, by Gavin Holt and Maisie Voss. Maisie had contributed illustrations on several pages, which were detailed and enthusiastic, and featured 4 stick figures in a garden. Gavin opened his mouth. Owen held up a hand. Let us finish first. The report was 11 pages long. It contained 3 sections. The first section was titled Evidence, and it documented, in the combined logic of a 7-year-old and a 6-year-old working in collaboration, the ways in which Gavin and Camille's daily behavior indicated romantic attachment. The evidence included the fact that Camille saved Gavin the last of the good coffee without being asked, and the fact that Gavin had fixed the broken hinge on Camille's office door without being asked, and the fact that they both laughed at the same things during movies and then tried to pretend they hadn't. It also included a section that Owen labeled body language, which Maisie had apparently explained to him from a book she'd found in Camille's study, and which Gavin could not get through without his face doing something he couldn't fully control. The second section was titled Benefits. It contained a bullet-pointed list. Owen had inherited Gavin's organizational tendencies that included items such as the garden would be used more, there would be 2 people to drive carpool, Maisie would stop pretending to be asleep when she was actually eavesdropping on adult conversations, and this last item in Maisie's handwriting, written in purple crayon, Owen and I already act like siblings, so it would just be correct. The third section was a graph. It was titled Family Happiness Forecast, and it showed a line that went up. The methodology was unclear, but the conclusion was unambiguous. Owen delivered the presentation with the seriousness of someone reading a board report. Maisie added commentary at key points, not because it had been planned, but because she had opinions and considered it her right to share them. When they finished, Owen set the report on the table between the 2 adults and folded his hands. We're open to questions, he said. Camille looked at Gavin. Her face was doing the thing it did when she was fighting the real laugh, pressing her lips together, which never actually worked. Gavin looked back at her and felt the laugh in his own chest and let it happen, because the alternative was holding it in, and that seemed beside the point. They both laughed, the real kind. Maisie looked at Owen with satisfaction. Owen looked at the table with the composure of someone who has deployed a strategy and is waiting for the outcome without wanting to appear to be waiting. Camille reached across the table and put her hand over Maisie's. This is a very thorough report, she said, when she'd recovered enough. Owen helped me with the graph, Maisie said. I helped him with the illustrations. I can see that. Camille looked at the purple crayon family in the garden. Maisie, did you actually want to draw 4 people? Or did you want to draw what you actually want? Maisie looked at her mother seriously. I drew what I want, she said. That's what it looks like. Camille looked at the drawing for a long moment. Then she looked at Gavin. He was already looking at her. They had been circling something for months, both of them aware of it, both of them moving toward it at the particular pace of people who have been hurt before, and who have more than themselves to consider. It wasn't cowardice. It was the opposite of cowardice, actually. The discipline of caring enough about something fragile not to rush it. But the children had built a graph. The children had called it a forecast. And sitting in the kitchen of the main house on a Saturday afternoon in April, with the garden visible through the window, and Owen's folded hands and Maisie's purple crayon, Gavin found that he had run out of reasons to keep circling. I'll be right back, Camille said. She stood up and left the kitchen. Her footsteps went down the hallway, then up the stairs, then back down. She was gone for approximately 3 minutes. When she came back, she was holding something small, and her composure was operating at near its limits, which Gavin recognized and which meant something important was happening. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. Then she walked to where Gavin was sitting and went down on one knee on the kitchen floor, which was not what he had expected and which produced identical expressions of wide-eyed shock on both children. She was holding a ring. Simple platinum band, a single diamond that caught the afternoon light through the window. It was not a ring she'd run out to buy in the last 3 minutes. She'd had it, which meant she'd been carrying this for some time, which meant she'd been moving toward this from farther back than he'd known. I had a plan, she said. It was a much better setting. There was a restaurant involved. She looked up at him. But your kid did a graph. Gavin looked at her. Gavin Holt, she said. And her voice was steady in the way his was steady during things that mattered. Not because she wasn't feeling it, but because she was feeling it completely and had chosen steady anyway. I was not looking for this. I was not looking for you. I had very successfully convinced myself that I didn't need any of it, and then you ran across a soccer field and took a bullet for my daughter, and then you refused my money and took the harder thing instead, and then you sat across from me in a room full of evidence of the worst year of my life, and you just worked the problem. With me. Not for me. She paused. I have never in my life had someone be in it with me like that. He said nothing. He was listening. So, she said, here's the plan. Marry me. Move into the main house. Help Owen and Maisie grow up in the same place. Build things that last. Argue with me when I'm wrong, which I will need and not always appreciate. And be here. That's the plan. Gavin looked at her for a moment. Then he reached into the pocket of his jeans. He put a ring box on the table. Camille stared at it. He opened it. A ring. Simple band, rose gold, a small diamond, and 2 flanking stones. Nothing extravagant, chosen carefully. He'd had it for 3 weeks, which was approximately 2.5 weeks longer than he'd been willing to acknowledge to himself that he had it. I was also going to pick a better moment, he said. I had a plan too. She looked at the ring, then at him. Then the laugh came again. The real one, undone, and she was on the kitchen floor and he was at the kitchen table and both children were watching with expressions that oscillated between triumph and the specific delight of having been right about something adults had been slow to understand. So, Gavin said. Yes. Yes, she said. Yes to your plan. Yes to the house and the garden and the argument and the work. He picked up the ring from the box. Yes. She was still laughing when he put the ring on her finger, and her hand was not entirely steady, and neither was his, and it was nothing like the clean romantic moments from movies, but it was entirely, specifically real, and that was better. Maisie threw herself at both of them simultaneously, which, given the geometry of the situation, created a brief, complicated pile on the kitchen floor that Gavin ended up at the bottom of. Owen stood at the table for a moment longer, 3 seconds, 4. And then he stepped over and sat down on the floor next to his father and leaned into him, and Gavin put his arm around his son and held on. I knew it, Owen said very quietly, to nobody in particular. You always know everything, Gavin said. Not everything, Owen said. Just this. They married in June, in the garden. It was not a large wedding. Camille had been briefly tempted towards something formal, old professional habit, the reflex to organize significant events at appropriate scale, and had talked herself out of it over 2 conversations with Gavin and 1 honest conversation with herself. What she wanted was the garden and the people who mattered, and a day that belonged entirely to the 4 of them rather than to anyone's expectations. That was what they had. Owen stood beside Gavin. Maisie stood beside Camille. Both children took their roles with great seriousness, which in Maisie's case included a dress she had specific opinions about, and in Owen's case included a tie that he wore without complaint, which Gavin privately considered more significant than anything else in the entire ceremony. Marcus Webb attended with his wife and cried, which he would have denied if asked, and which everyone pretended not to notice. Detective Marsh came. Greg Tanner came. Priya Sohn sent flowers from Denver because she couldn't make it, with a note that said, "Congratulations on the structural integrity." Ray Delacoste, Gavin's old foreman, drove up from Westbridge's south side and shook Gavin's hand and said, "You've done all right for yourself," which was the highest compliment Ray gave anyone, and which Gavin received accordingly. Diane Chu came and kept checking her phone because there was a media cycle she was managing and a press release about Voss Meridian's 4th quarter performance that was dropping that afternoon, and she had to be reminded twice by Camille to put the phone away, and she put it away, and then checked it once more and was caught, and looked genuinely apologetic. Camille's general counsel came and wept openly during the vows, which was surprising to everyone who knew him professionally and surprising to no one who knew him personally. The vows themselves were not elaborate. They discussed writing their own and had both independently reached the conclusion that the traditional form would serve better, not from lack of things to say, but because there were children listening, and what they wanted the children to understand was not romantic eloquence, but plain commitment, to have and to hold. In sickness and in health. That was the actual thing. The rest was commentary. Gavin said his vows looking at Camille, and she said hers looking at him, and both of them meant every word in the particular way that people mean things when they have earned the right to say them. Not through suffering, though there had been that, but through the harder discipline of choosing to try again, when trying again was not a certainty and was not comfortable and required more of them than the first time had because they were older and knew more about what could go wrong. Maisie cried during the vows, which she had not been planning to do and which she was briefly embarrassed about. Owen handed her a tissue from his jacket pocket, which he had put there specifically for her, which he had known she might need. She took it without comment. He looked at the garden. After, in the photographs that Camille's assistant took, a woman who had been enlisted as photographer on the basis of her excellent eye and moderate skill, a combination that produced results that were genuine rather than polished. There is one photograph in particular that is not the most technically accomplished, but is the truest of the set. It shows all 4 of them standing in the garden in the late afternoon light, Gavin with his arm around Camille, Maisie holding Owen's hand, and every face in the photograph is mid-sentence or mid-laugh or turned slightly towards someone else. And nobody is looking at the camera, and the garden is very green behind them, and it looks like a family because it is one. 6 months after the wedding, the Alder Street rental was fully vacated, and the guest house stood empty. All 4 of them were in the main house, which had been adjusted for the new configuration in the particular negotiated way of 4 people with their own habits and requirements learning to occupy a shared space. Owen's cleats remained precisely parallel by the door, which was now the main house door. Maisie's drawings covered the refrigerator in a dense exhibition that spilled onto the wall beside it. Gavin had reorganized the kitchen, and Camille had pushed back on 2 elements of the reorganization, and they had reached a compromise that neither of them was fully satisfied with, and that they both found entirely acceptable. There was a morning in October, about a year after the park, when Gavin was in the garden early. He'd started drinking his first coffee outside when the weather permitted, a habit he hadn't had before, and that had somehow arrived along with the garden and the house and the particular texture of the life he was currently living. The air was cold and the maples were going red again, and the city below the hills was just beginning to generate its morning sound. Maisie came out in pajamas and rain boots, which she had put on in that order and had not swapped when she noticed the error, and sat on the garden bench beside him without asking permission. "You're up early," Gavin said. "Couldn't sleep." She studied the garden with the evaluative eye of someone who had strong opinions about it. "Dad." He looked at her. She called him Dad. She'd started around the second month and hadn't made an announcement about it, and neither had he. And Owen called Camille Mom now, and nobody had established a policy or a timeline for any of it. It had simply happened the way things happen when they are true, which is without fanfare and without ceremony and in the ordinary early morning light. "Yeah," he said. "If you hadn't come to the park that day," she said, with the directness of a child who had been turning something over for a while and had decided to just ask it, what would have happened? He considered the question seriously because she was asking it seriously. "I don't know," he said. "Something different." "Bad different." "Maybe." He looked at his coffee. "But here's the thing about that question. I did come to the park. What happened after? That's real. The other version isn't." Maisie thought about this. "Owen says you're good at being where you are," she said. "He says you don't think about the bad thing that could have happened. You just fix what's there." Gavin looked at the garden. He thought about Owen saying that, about the version of himself his son was describing, about whether it was accurate and whether he'd earned it. He thought about the hospital ceiling and the way the cottonwood tree had been dropping its leaves, unhurried. He thought about running across a soccer field toward danger with nothing in his mind except the simple arithmetic of a child in the path of a raised gun. He didn't think of himself as a hero. Heroes in his experience were mostly a story. People told to make sense of something they couldn't otherwise explain. What he knew about himself was this. He had been broken in a particular way and had carried the breakage carefully for long enough that he'd started to mistake the carrying for living. And then one afternoon in a park, he'd stopped carrying it, not because of a decision, but because something mattered more than the careful maintenance of his own distance. That was the thing nobody told you about the walls you built around yourself. They kept things out, yes. That was the point of them. But they didn't care what they kept out, and they kept out the things you needed as efficiently as they kept out the things you feared. He had dismantled his walls one afternoon without meaning to, running across a field, and had stood in the rubble of them bleeding on the ground with a small girl's hands on his wound and his son across the field and the sirens coming, and the world had flooded back in. All of it. The grief and the love and the terrifying availability of caring about people who could be taken. He hadn't chosen any of it. He'd just been standing there when it happened. Maybe that was the only way it worked. Maybe readiness wasn't real, and you didn't walk into the important things prepared. You were just in the park one afternoon, and then you weren't the same person you'd been an hour before. "Your mom knew the same thing," he told Maisie. "She was in the park. She stayed." Maisie leaned into his arm. Not dramatically, just slightly, the way she sometimes did without appearing to notice she was doing it. She was 6 years old, and she had placed her hands on a stranger's wound and held steady. She was 7 now, and she drew purple crayon families and corrected her mother's scheduling habits and had opinions about the garden and called Gavin Dad without making it a thing. "I think the park was good," Maisie said, "even though it was bad." He didn't answer right away. He thought about a scar below his left ribs and a bullet that had taken something from him and given something back in the same instant, and how those two things, the taking and the giving, were not separate events but the same one, looked at from different angles. "Yeah," he said finally, "I think so too." They sat in the garden until the coffee was cold and the maples were bright red in the early light, and the city below them was fully awake and going about its business, indifferent and continuous, the way cities go. And then Maisie announced she was hungry, using the specific intonation that communicated this was now a matter of some urgency, and Gavin went inside to make breakfast. Owen was already at the table, hair damp, school bag on the chair beside him. Camille was pouring coffee with one hand and reading something on her tablet with the other, which was a habit she was allegedly working on. The kitchen smelled like toast. Someone had already fed the cat. They'd gotten a cat in February, a gray and deeply opinionated animal that Owen had named correctly on the first try by calling it Seven, because it had 7 toes on 1 foot, a fact Gavin had discovered only after the name stuck. Seven was on the counter, which it was not supposed to be, watching Camille's coffee with the focused attention of an animal who had no intention of touching the coffee but wanted everyone to understand it was a possibility. "Seven," Gavin said. Seven looked at him. "No." Seven stepped deliberately to the edge of the counter, considered the coffee, and stepped back. Not off the counter, just back. The distinction felt important to Seven. Owen was watching this with the quiet amusement of someone who found the cat's negotiations genuinely interesting. Maisie came in from the garden and put both hands on the table and said she was extremely hungry and also the maples needed raking, in that order, as though the two things were connected. Camille looked up from her tablet. "Good morning to you too." "Good morning," Maisie said correctly. Then, "The maples. I know about the maples. They need raking." "This weekend," Gavin said, getting eggs from the refrigerator. "Both of you." Owen looked up from his toast. "I have soccer. After soccer. Maisie doesn't play soccer. Maisie can rake." Maisie sat down and considered whether raking was acceptable. "Can I keep the leaves?" "What would you do with the leaves?" Camille asked. "Jump in them," Maisie said, as if this were obvious, because it was. "Then yes," Gavin said. "You can keep the leaves." Camille caught his eye across the kitchen. She was almost smiling, the way she did in the mornings before the day had fully assembled itself around her. A slightly unguarded version, quieter than the version the world saw. He'd come to consider it one of the better things about mornings. He cracked eggs into the pan. This was the shape of it. Not the park, not the warehouse, not the courtroom, not the proposal on the kitchen floor. Those were the things that had happened to get here. This was the actual thing. The breakfast and the cat on the counter, and the argument about leaves and the tablet that Camille was now, under light social pressure, putting face down on the table. This was what it meant to be in someone's life rather than adjacent to it. Gavin had thought, for a long time, that the life he was living before the park was a kind of discipline, self-protective, responsible. He'd raised Owen carefully, worked honestly, kept the walls in order. He hadn't understood until those walls were gone that discipline in the service of absence is just a more organized form of giving up. The things worth having don't let you stay safe. They ask more of you than safety asks, and they give more back than safety gives. And the accounting only makes sense from the inside. He had taken a bullet for a child he'd never met. He had gotten, in return, more than he'd had any right to expect. Not because the universe was arranged fairly, it wasn't, and he knew that better than most. But because one afternoon in a park, the version of him he'd been trying to bury had proved more durable than the life he'd built on top of it. The seal and the father and the grieving husband and the man who'd run toward danger because there was a 6-year-old in its path. Those weren't separate people. They were the same person, and he had spent 3 years pretending otherwise, and the pretending had cost him 3 years. He wasn't getting those years back. But the morning was very good. Edie put eggs on 4 plates and called everyone to the table, and 7 jumped off the counter and went to sit near Owen, who was its preferred person, and Maisie was explaining the projected leaf pile to Camille with architectural specificity, and Owen was eating with the focused efficiency of someone with a schedule to keep. And outside the kitchen window, the red maples stood in the October light, very bright, very alive, burning with the ordinary beauty of things that change every year and come back anyway. Gavin sat down at the table. He was where he was. That was enough. That was, in the end, everything.